Today, let's walk through a brand new quilt pattern. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are going through a brand new Fun with Rectangles quilt pattern. So there is a whole Etsy pattern available for this as well in case you want the entire instructions. But to start off, you are going to need 36 rectangles that are 6.5 by 3.5 inches, and then also cutting out 72 squares that are 3.5 by 3.5 inches as well. Now in the Etsy pattern, all of those measurements are also in centimeters in case you are somebody who works in the metric system, but you're just going to go through and cut out all of those squares, all those rectangles from whatever fabrics you want to use. Now here is my selection of fabrics. I'm doing this as a fall theme, so I have a fun scarecrow pattern as well as some fall leaves. And then what we're going to be doing is matching up our squares currently, so you're going to be matching two squares together with right sides together. So I have these sort of sorted out right now. So I am just matching two squares with right sides together and then pinning along one of those edges. It does not matter what edge you do unless your fabric has some sort of direction to it, but for mine I'm just going through and pinning them up along one of the edges after I have matched all of them through. Now once you have matched all of your pairs, you should have 36 matched pairs of squares, so it would be the same number as the amount of rectangles that you cut out. We are just going to go through and take a seam along that one edge that we pinned up. So this is going to allow us to have this little matching pair set. So we are just going to go through and take that seam. Now for this, you're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I like to use this little 1/4 inch quilting foot. I find it so helpful, and then you just want to set up your needle correctly with it. But I will include a link to that below in case you're interested in getting one for yourself, and I have a whole video on how to use it. It's very easy though, as you just line up your fabric with the little edge of that presser foot, and then you can begin taking your seams. So for this, I am doing like a daisy chain method so that I'm able to just do them all together, and it makes it a lot faster and a lot easier than having to start and stop for each one. I do backstitch though, just to make sure the seam's secure. So here are all my squares together. So now we're going to go through is separate these so that they are all individual, and then we will go and press this out. So as you can see when we open it, that we have these two squares are now sewed together. It looks really nice. I'm just going to go press open the seam so that we'll be able to then continue on working with it. Pressing it open is also a great opportunity to get out any wrinkles or folds that are in your fabric before we get too far along. So once you have all of those done, you are then going to start matching each of those squares with a rectangle. So this is how we are building out essentially our blocks for this quilt. So I have each of those pairs I just sewn up are matched with then some sort of rectangle piece. If you did this all with the exact same color fabric for the rectangle, this would be incredibly simple. I had two, so I went through and just kind of divided which ones I wanted to go where. Now, very similar to before, we are matching these with right sides together. So you see both the right sides of the fabric are now in the middle, and then I'm going to be taking one seam on the side. So for mine, I'm specifically doing this right edge. So I'm just going to be clipping this up. Again, you can use clips, you can use pins, whichever you're more comfortable with, and then taking that seam. Now I'm going to repeat this exact same process for all of the other squares as well, so that they are all pinned up, and I'm able to then just take that seam to make it nice and quick and easy to get all of these squares completed. I am again using my 1/4 inch pressing foot and just taking that continuous stitching, being sure I'm back stitching at the beginning and end so that it stays secure and in place. One item that I will note is because we are sewing these two square pairs together, you can see that we have that pressed open seam that we did. You want to make sure that you are sewing over that so it's nice and flat and smooth, and part of it doesn't fold over. It's just going to give your quilt a much nicer look if you can get that to be sewn so that it is pressed open instead of having it closed. Once you have that done though, this is what all of your squares will now look like, so we are just going to cut through them. And what I will say is if you do find that one of your seams did not press open correctly, it's okay, it's not a big deal. It's just more of like a small finishing item that if you really want to try to make sure that everything is laying well, you can try to keep that pressed open. Now I'm going to do the same thing of pressing open that new seam for the rest of my squares. So once you have them all pressed, it is then time to lay out how you want your squares to be done for your quilt. So I found this to be so exciting, and then we are just going to be matching two squares together at a time to complete a whole column, and continuing this for the entirety of your quilt. So this is where things are really starting to come together. As you can see, I have them all laid out how I want them to be. So I like to start with one column and then work my way down the quilt, but if you're somebody who wants to work on the rows first, you could definitely do that as well. There's really no wrong way to do this. As you can see here, I have my two squares, so I'm going to fold that top square down over the bottom square and then make sure right sides are together. And then the seam up at the top, I'm going to make sure that there is a matching point where those two seams are coming together. So this is going to allow you to have a really seamless looking quilt, and you won't be able to tell, like where that seam actually started. And then we're just going to be taking a seam all the way along that edge. So now I'm going to continue that same process for the rest of these squares. Again, if you're more comfortable working on this just like in a one column by one column, you can do that. I'm just pinning all of these up so that they are ready to go. They are still in their column form, as you can see. And then I am just going to start taking that stitch to stitch the two squares in place and continue this for the entire quilt. Now at this point, make sure that when you are sewing these, that seam that we pressed open stays open, and then you're going to have two pairs like this together. And now I'm just going to continue this on as I keep building out the columns for my quilt. And as we just keep adding more and more squares to our already done column. So this column has 4 squares now added to it, so I'm just going to work on the final 2 squares that would go along in that column. The best part about this quilt is it is all very repetitive, so once you get one step down, you're really just repeating that for the entire step, so in this case to get the entire column. And then once you have one column done, you could then move on to the next column. So as you can see here that we have everything starting to come together, it's looking really good, and then you're just going to be combining these into your second column and continuing this process on as you keep building out your quilt. I find it a lot easier to already have your columns done and then just attaching those columns together into one straight seam, but again, it is completely up to you. My biggest piece of advice when you are matching your squares is just being sure that you are matching any of those seams first. And then if you do find one where, somehow the rectangle got cut incorrectly at the beginning, you can always just take that out and then redo the seam so that you're able to make sure that it's all laying nice and flat and smooth and the dimensions are correct. So once you have all of your columns done, we are then going to be sewing these columns together. Before we do that though, we want to press open all of our seams so that they're all laying nice and flat and smooth so that we can then attach all of these together into our final quilt top. Once it's all pressed out, we can then start to combine our columns together, so matching with right sides together, one pair of columns, then another pair of columns, and then another pair. So as you can see here, I'm taking that one column, folding it on top of the other column, matching with right sides together, being sure that these seams are matching and that they are lining up. If you did your measurements correctly, all of them should line up, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue. But again, if you do notice that one seems a little bigger or it's not lining up correctly, you can always just use your seam ripper to undo that one seam, and then you can try to readjust it so that it will lay properly. Once you have it all nice and pinned up, you're just going to take that seam along your pinned edge and then repeat this exact same process for your other columns so that you're able to get all of these matching sets. So I have my 3 column pairs now, and I'm just going to go through and sew all of this together. So once you have gone through and you've sewn up your columns, you will see that you have 3 different sets now. So now it's just time to put all of these together into one quilt top. So for this, I did do this kind of at the same time, where I matched one of the pairs with the right side to the one in the middle, and then I repeated that same process for the other sides. As you can see, you're just folding this over so the right sides are together, matching up those seams again, being sure that they are matched the best that they can, and then you are then going to repeat this exact same process for the other side. If you wanted to do this in 2 separate steps, you definitely could. It's really just a matter of personal preference, and as you can see, our quilt top is really growing at this point. And I think the best part about this quilt is that it looks very complex because you have a lot of small pieces that are coming together, but overall it's a very beginner friendly project just because these are only squares and rectangles, and it ends up looking really nice and perfect for something that you can hang in your home or give to a family member. Once you have it all sewn up though, here's your quilt top. It is complete. I absolutely love how this turned out. It is so pretty. I made mine for fall, as you can tell, and it looks great. So now it's just time to do those finishing steps. So you want to have some sort of backing material. I got this fabric from Spoonflower and it looks really nice with the colors on the front. You are also going to want some sort of batting in the middle for your quilt. I will include a link to the type of batting that I use. I find that this one is really helpful. It's like a cotton batting. And then I have these so that it's sandwiched together with the back of the fabric is face down, and then you have your batting and then the quilt top. And then I went through and I just marked off straight lines, and I'm doing a computerized stitched on my sewing machine across those straight lines. Now there are lots of different machine quilting methods you can use on your home sewing machine. You could do a computerized method, you could just do a stitch in the ditch, which is just straight lines, or you could do some sort of free form quilting, and I will include a video on that if you're interested. Once you have your quilting done though, as you can see, I just have this fun like diagonal effect. You're just going to go through, trim off any of the edges to be the sizing and shape that you want it to be. You may have a little extra batting hanging off one edge that just needs to be trimmed up, and then you're going to be making your binding. Now I'm not going to go too much into detail for the binding here. I like to just use strips of material that I have left over, and then I'm sewing this on the diagonal to attach these two pieces together so it's less bulky. Then you would cut off any extra fabric, and then you just go through and make your binding very similar to any other binding you have. I will include a link to a video that talks even more about that, as this video is getting a little long and people have a lot of different ways that they like to make their binding, and there really is no right or wrong way. As you can see though, I have now matched it with right sides together along my entirety of my quilt, and I am just going to start sewing this in place. Binding to me is incredibly exciting because it means you're almost done with your quilt. Once you have that initial sewing done on it where it is sewn onto your quilt, stuffing is here too. We are just now going to go through and do a hand stitch to actually sew this in place. I love doing this because it gives it a really nice, almost invisible look on the back so you can't actually see it's there. But here's my completed quilt. Again, there is a whole Etsy pattern for this if you want even more information. Let me know if you make this and if you love the pattern. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next.